Season 1 of Heavenly Delusion was really good. Almost perfect. The story is incredibly intriguing, the action is breathtaking, and each primary character in the ensemble cast was remarkable and well thought out. But for me, despite the incredible execution, there was one decision they made that I think overshadowed the rest. My name is Pei, and today we're talking about how Heavenly Delusion was almost perfect. The show follows two separate storylines. The first follows Maru and Kiriko, two young and interesting characters who are exploring a post-apocalyptic world. During this exploration, they have runs in with a range of different people and monsters. Specifically, these monsters are called man-eaters. While the characters in the story don't understand where they came from very much, they know they're very dangerous and that they have all sorts of clever and terrifying ways in which they consume people. In a lot of ways, it's a very classic monster trope, but it's done pretty well. One of our main characters, Maru, has an ability to kill these monsters when other people don't. By touching them, he can access some core part of their spirit and kill them. He's a very skilled fighter, and we as the audience get to explore that in a couple remarkable different fight scenes against the monsters and other humans. This storyline is juxtaposed by a group of students, young and unaware of the outside world. These kids all seem to have a range of different otherworldly skills and talents. As the story continues, we see a range of different integration as we find out that the main two characters are looking for something called heaven with little to no information. So from the start, we're aware of the fact that these two storylines in some way are converging. Part of what makes this show work so well is how each storyline feels so unique to one another, and it's all built around great characters, world building, and plot decisions. So if I love this show so much, why is there one decision that seems to overshadow everything else? Before answering that question, I want to talk about another show. I don't like Black Mirror very much. A lot of people love the show, and that's very valid. However, one of my main criticisms is, as someone that gets very invested in media, sometimes it felt like Black Mirror chose to tell dark stories, and then there would be a moment where they pushed that darkness too far. Some people love shows like this, but for me, it always ended up resulting in a bit of an existential crisis, almost like the writers didn't understand the magnitude of what they were writing. Now, some people might very fairly point out that this is the whole point of Black Mirror. What a ridiculous thing to criticize it for. And while at times I do think it feels very pseudo-intellectual, I don't think this is actually a fair criticism outside of the realm of, this is the reason I don't like it. It'd be like criticizing a horror movie for being scary. That's the whole point. But there's been this trend that these shocking dark moments tend to resonate emotionally with the audience. They stir a reaction, they're controversial. So a lot of shows have now adopted doing these extremely dark moments that result in this very jarring tonal mismatch. Heavenly Delusion is a dark show. It just felt like one scene was so much more extreme than the others. Dark moments, even suddenly dark moments, are very common in anime, and some of the most memorable scenes from some of our favorite shows were incredibly dark and almost out of nowhere. Part of the reason I think anime can get away with this is because of a term I use called medium-inspired suspension of disbelief. When the Looney Tunes show extreme violence, it doesn't feel so extreme because it's a cartoon. Or when I was a kid playing Counter-Strike or Call of Duty, and my parents were like, "Doesn't this feel really violent?" I knew it wasn't akin to real violence because every single time I or someone else got shot in the game, we would respawn. This doesn't just apply to violence. Exaggerated actions like Naruto running or leaping from branch to branch feel realistic. Because in consuming an animated product, I think that our suspension of disbelief is expanded. But very often in anime, a scene accurately represents the horror of a situation. And much like my problem with Black Mirror, I can't help but be incredibly invested, and as a byproduct, go through an almost existential dread that comes with the terrifying realization of the horribly violent or dark scene. Right, why was it almost perfect? After finishing the show, I felt a little crazy. So I decided to do some research online, and I found I wasn't the only person that had this issue with Heavenly Delusion. To clarify, I loved this show. I will continue watching this show. I will suggest this show to other people, but not without an asterisk. Because after watching this show, and specifically one scene, I wish I'd been given a content warning. So if you want to hear that content warning, I'll say it in a second, but if you want to avoid any form of spoilers, even though this is a small spoiler, you can skip to this timestamp. Okay. In Heavenly Delusion, there's a very, very intense sexual assault scene. And an important clarification is while the scene was very dark, a lot of the violence was implied more than it was overtly shown, like previous controversial anime scenes like the one from Goblin Slayer. More so, because of the magic system and established plot, they took a very scary situation and made it way, way darker. For me, it was really hard to watch, and I wished I'd been given some sort of warning. Okay, now that I'm done with that explanation and everyone's back, I'm not really in a place where I'm ready to say that it was a mistake to include this in the story. I do believe there are sensitive topics that should be treated with respect, but I also believe that scenes like this can be explored in a healthy and productive way. Actually, a lot of my issues with this scene can be reduced to two different factors: trope and necessity. While I don't want to necessarily deep dive too much into the scene, I do want to talk about a trope that I think is incredibly important to factor in, something that made this scene less consumable for me, context that I think is important. Just a quick heads up, there's going to be slight spoilers here, but I won't be revealing any specific plot points from the story. My biggest problem with this scene revolves around a common trope called women in refrigerators. This trope criticizes the common occurrence in which violence against female characters is used primarily to serve another character's development, develop the plot, or give a character a badass revenge moment. I struggle a lot with this trope because I think it undermines intense violence. For me, haphazard use of this can really ruin a story. One of my main problems with this is it often feels super short-sighted, reducing or killing off a character that often is very interesting simply in an attempt to prop up another, especially since it feels like lazy writing, because there's other ways to give characters their moment, which leads to my second point: necessity. I'm not sure that this decision was completely necessary, specifically the severity. I'm working from the perspective of a show-only viewer, so there's the possibility that later in the story it will make more sense, but based off of the information we have right now, I think this moment didn't need to be so dark to fill the same role in the story. And while they simply couldn't just change the situation without there suddenly becoming some plot holes and issues with the realism of the story, I do think that they could have set up the situation differently. Maybe using the threats of violence rather than actual extreme violence, because I think the severity of the violence wasn't necessarily required to get the stakes and trauma that were probably important parts of telling the story. Writers get to choose any world to tell their story in and write any plot they want to, so when they choose to include something, it is a choice. And maybe the story will have an answer, some more significant reason as to why this all happened in Season 1. But I do think you can analyze seasons on their individual merit, and I think Season 1 of Heavenly Delusion ultimately ended with a bitter taste. I am captured by this story, I believe in the characters. The author has done such a good job of selling me on so many different things. It's likely the reason I'm holding this to such a high standard. But this decision was hard for me. One I got stuck on, something that has overshadowed all the good in the weeks that have passed since I finished the show. This experience might be unique to me. The whole point of this video was to explore why, despite so many parts I enjoyed, when I've talked to my roommates and friends about this show, this is what I've talked about. Part of this is probably the fact that I feel a little bit crazy. Maybe this scene didn't bother people in the same way it did me. But I love this show. I really want to talk about this show, but it feels like there wasn't a video I could make without talking about this first. Because for me, Heavenly Delusion was almost perfect.